welcome everybody. I'm Thea Alley. I'm one of the hosts of the LDRship podcast. And for those of you who are returning listeners, as you know, we seek to discuss our disagreements to help inform your decisions. So I'm here tonight with my co-hosts, Brett, Will, and Dion. And we are here to talk this week to talk about rights and basically what are rights and who gives them to us. So the framing for this episode is really to talk about or to think about what are the things that we believe what are the rights that we believe all people should be entitled to, regardless of what the government says, or do we believe that it's the role of government to protect our rights, to provide us rights? Where are the lines? This is a topic that we've kind of touched on a little bit in our first episode, but we feel like our discussions have evolved. And so, especially with some of the different debates that we've seen in current events in recent weeks, we thought this would be a topical discussion or a pertinent discussion or topic for this week. So on that note, I don't know who wants to kind of kick us off. I might kick this to Dion, the libertarian, because I feel like maybe this is a good one to start with, maybe a more of a centrist position. So Dion, any thoughts?
On the scale of personal liberties and rights, I'm not sure that I'm the centrist.
I don't know.
But I would say that the libertarian point of view and my own point of view kind of coincides with what the founding fathers wrote in the Declaration of Independence, what they said about the Bill of Rights. So for anybody who does not have the Declaration of Independence memorized, they wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." And during that same period of time when they were creating the new government, Sam Adams wrote in a paper, "Among the natural rights of the colonists are these: first, a right to life; second, to liberty; third, to property, together with the right to support and defend them in the best manner they can." So that's kind of where I stand, is that the rights that we have are given to us by our Creator. They wrote it with a lowercase c, and I think they did that to sort of make it more encompassing than just a Judeo-Christian creator. If you believe that we don't have a personal creator, but that we were created from the essence of the universe, Big Bang, that kind of thing, I think that counts, right? But basically that the fact of our existence imbues us with certain rights: life, liberty. They say the pursuit of happiness. They also mention property, which is that those things which I legally and rightfully own are mine and should not be taken from me by force. So yeah, that's kind of where I stand, and that it's the government's job to make sure that other people do not violate my rights.
I like, Dion, I like the fact, so I hadn't noticed it before. One of the issues that I was coming up with was, what's the precedence of those rights, right? Like, right to life versus liberty. And, we talked about how this conversation is probably going to go in the direction of COVID, just because it exemplifies some of those issues. But if one side is saying, well, I have the right to life, therefore X, and the other side says, well, I have the right to liberty, therefore Y, which one takes precedence? Which one should we follow? And I didn't know about kind of Adams's priorities. First among these is life, but then it also kind of just makes sense, just the fact that the order that they wrote it was life, liberty, and then the pursuit. So I think that certainly when we're talking about the examples that come up with COVID, where, Democrats are going to say, well, we, because we have a right to life, therefore other people should have to wear masks, or precautions should be taken to slow the spread of COVID, which would mean shutting down businesses, things like that. And Republicans, conservatives on the other side would say, yeah, but I've got liberty, therefore I should be able to do what I want and not wear a mask or to keep a business open. And I think that's one of those instances where those two fundamental rights kind of come into conflict.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think that is probably what makes this discussion difficult because, the libertarian in me wants to say that, especially in light of what we have revealed over the past 5 years about COVID, about its actual deadliness, about its actual transmission rates, who among our population were most affected by COVID itself, and then the second and third order effects that we saw from schools and businesses and things shutting down. I think all of that in hindsight makes my argument easier because I can say, well, the overall death rate, and it depends on how you measure it. It's hard to find a very accurate number because it all depends on how they were taking measurements. But it's on the order of about 1% was the actual death rate of people who got infected with COVID and then died from it directly. And so in hindsight, you could say, well, we did all of this stuff to rob people of liberty, and it really was not the threat to life that it was originally made out to be. Now, in the moment, I think even at the very beginning, when we first knew nothing about COVID, I think even all but the most hard-edged libertarians would probably have erred on the side of caution and said, I will do this for right now until we know more, because it makes sense to put life above liberty in the hierarchy.
And I think, to not, at some point, we're going to have our COVID podcast, right? And to keep this from going strictly down COVID, I mean, I'm glad that you said that what you finished up with, that even other than the most hardline libertarian, you would err on the side of life over liberty, because I would question, well, how many lives, is your liberty worth 1 life, 2 lives, 10 lives? How many lives is worth it, for the liberty? And, and I think that's kind of, whether it's COVID or, but anything else, you can't yell fire in a movie theater, right? People's.
Actually, Thea, I think you can actually, that's not strictly prohibited.
Is that no longer true?
I mean, it would be if there's a fire. You definitely could be held liable if you maliciously yelled fire in a crowded movie theater, knowing there's no fire, with the intent to start a stampede. But right. I understand the whole. I mean, it kind of you're opening the door for the idea that no right is absolute in this country, right? And so, even when we argue that that the Constitution as it was written, was designed to protect or to guarantee the citizen's life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, but at the end of the day, we still also have the death penalty is legal in this country. People are in prisons, and so we have made an agreement under the law that there are restrictions on these rights, right? And so, I think the rule of government is really enforcing the rule of law and trying to set the parameters based on what the people have said. These are the parameters of our rights. And I think where we're seeing what we've seen throughout our history, I don't even think this is a current issue, is there's always this tension between certain people who want to favor, who are looking at, hey, my right to X, and then somebody else is saying, well, what about my right to Y, right? And when that tension ensues is when we start having these kinds of conversations. And so, with COVID, you're saying, okay, well, a certain percentage of the population was more at risk than others, right? And so for those people, they're looking to the government to protect their right to life and saying, look, I'm at risk, and I'm expecting the government to put measures in place to help put me at less risk, or to do more to mitigate the risk. But then at the same time, it had a negative effect on the liberty of the masses. So then the question really becomes, and I think I say this now every week, well, who do we want to be as a country? And like kind of Will was kind of hinting at this. At what point does my right to liberty then impose or means that somebody else's right to life is threatened, right? Or
I
my
would like
my
to,
religious right. Yeah, go on.
for the purposes of this discussion, I'd also, what happens if I flip that? How many
Mhm.
people's liberties is it okay to take away to save a life?
And that's
Because I
that's
think
the
that's an
question,
important
right?
discussion too.
I agree. I agree. I think that's it. And I think that's the question. I would argue, and I think more and more in doing this podcast, I find myself coming back to the I'm my brother's keeper. And I really think that is how I look at like how I view my role and like how we live in a society where we all are kind of in this together. So for me personally, I lean on the side of I would rather see people's liberties infringed upon than people's lives threatened. And so for me, I think my tolerance for the infringement of those liberties was much higher than others, right? Not even just for when it comes to COVID. I'll use this with guns. I'm not, we haven't had a conversation about the Second Amendment. And I know, Dion, one of the things, when you were doing the research for this week, you were looking into the Heller case. I disagree with the Heller decision. I'm not a fan of the idea that everybody should have unrestricted access to weapons. And it feels like that's become the progeny of the Heller decision, is this idea that the Second Amendment is this right that cannot be infringed upon or can only barely be infringed upon. And I know you and I probably differ on this based on, what your wife does. But yeah, so that's another right where I think I would rather that liberty be infringed upon to guarantee the safety of our population, especially when we look at mass shootings and access to guns and some of the outcomes of it, right? So it's not just a COVID thing. In general, I am okay with
Yeah.
restricting liberty in the name of safety.
And it is interesting that, I mean, depending on the issue we're talking about, it seems like the country has, so in the Heller case with Second Amendment rights, we're very thou shalt not infringe on those liberties, but we do, in order to protect, like thou shalt not kill, we do say every single person is restricted in their liberties to go around killing people. We can't have the purge, regardless of what certain
But that goes back to the right to life being the most important one, right? So if I have a right to life, then that, and secondary to that is your right to liberty, then your right to go around just shooting up wherever you want is superseded by my right to life, right?
But
Well, I think that's what it really comes down to, guys, is the whole debate, right? When people talk about rights, it's those that naturally exist, and they exist in a way that they do not impose obligations on others beyond respecting their rights, right? Because it's one of those that, yeah, you might have liberty, but liberty is not unlimited, right? As soon as you bump up against other people's rights, which, like Dion is saying, the first one being life, you're limited in what you can do. When you start getting into issues beyond that in terms of how we handle it by law, this is where we start talking about social constructs and social contracts, right? And that's where it plays into with Thea's idea of what kind of society do we want to be. And that's where we have to look at those kind of things. And a lot of this, it, again, comes a lot from my arguments that I've had before with this, is that it comes down to how do we fundamentally educate people? What kind of values do we have? How do we teach those values? And that is dependent mostly on the community you're raised in and the environment that you're in and how those values come about. I think that plays a lot into how we, again, value life first. You guys know me. That's my big thing. Life is the most important. People are important. That's where we should all start from. But we have those individual liberties to be able to pursue things and do what we, choose to pursue and do. And if things that we've earned, we have rights to those. And we can't push back against that. So we have to come back to that again, things that exist naturally, which, again, it's the life, the liberty, and, pursuit of happiness, AKA property. plays into that. But then we have to look at it to where do we start bumping up against impinging upon other people's rights? And that's, of course, where the gray area really comes in.
Well, and I find it's interesting. So you say AKA property with pursuit of happiness, but I mean, it's relatively straightforward for us to discuss life versus liberty. But I like, how do you bring it? Okay. The pursuit of happiness. Well, what if it makes me happy to, well, I don't want to go to that extreme, like going around purging people, but to bring up the COVID thing again, like, does that mean like having a job and going to your job every day and not being forced to stay home? Like, does that count as, pursuit of happiness, pursuit of a paycheck that therefore you can then go buy necessities with?
Well, yeah, because you have the rights to the fruit of your labor, right? Now, if you are restricted from labor, how do you pursue those fruits? So that's a big thing. Now, you can choose not to work, right? But there's a fruit that comes from that also. But to where the government can say, no, you can't work, or no, you can't run your business, I think that's a big problem. Because people will choose with their dollars what they want to do. That's the benefits of the free market. If you offer a service that's not valuable to other people, they're not going to pay for it. And then you need to change your business model, right? That's kind of the play out with it.
So you're against like ethanol subsidies and that kind of stuff?
I am.
Yeah, it creates an imbalance in the market. It really does.
Yeah.
It's like if you let the market play out itself long enough, people will make the choices based on that. Now, we need proper information to go along with that, right? When people are informed with the right information, then they can make better decisions with that. And so we need to make sure that people are informed with that. That's part of, I think pursuit of happiness is education. You need to be able to educate yourself. I mean, that's a huge conversation I've had with people lately is, okay, we need to change our systems to stop telling people what to think and start switching to changing them how to think, actually create critical thought processes where people can come up with information. Because, oh my gosh, like, I'm sure you guys have seen it all across social media lately. We have these extreme polarizing views of people, and all they're doing is just parroting memes that somebody else put out there. There's no thought behind it. They're just, oh, look at what this guy said. This is accurate. And you're like, well, no, it's actually not, because if you go and look at the information and dig into it and educate yourself, you'll find that it's only a half truth, right? So it could be the kind of same things with subsidies. I don't agree with them. I don't think they're necessary. I think the market will play out. But again, people need information about what the technologies can do to make right decisions.
Yeah.
One of the things that I wanted to bring up.
Oh,
sorry, I didn't want this to get into like an economics and subsidies discussion, because we're talking about rights.
It plays out to the whole that it's not a free market, right? We've made a decision as a society to intervene and kind of put our thumb on the scale when it comes to certain areas of the economy. And I mean, even when we talk about taxes, right? Like the idea that, in a free market, you wouldn't necessarily pay money to the government, right? It's not a transaction that all of us opted into individually to pay X amount of our income to the government to get X and Y in return, right? But yet here we are. So I do think that we have given a certain level of our rights as a society. We have deferred to the government and allowed the government to put its thumb on the scale in all these different areas. And the same is true with our rights, right? Because even within, the analogy of, well, the market will decide, we've said that there's certain things we don't allow the market to decide, right? We say, hey, it's illegal to sell certain things, right? You can't sell fully automatic weapon on legally in the United States, right? You can't do these certain things. We've said, because of these other things that we've said that are important, we've restricted rights. So I do think it's an interesting, again, there's this tension where anytime somebody tells me, well, I have the right to do X, I almost laugh, because I'm like, any lawyer can show you how that right can be restricted a million different ways. You don't have any absolute right in this country. And so I always find it kind of artificial to even have this discussion that I agree that the rights that occur naturally, yes, they're rights that occur naturally, but we've given the government the power to restrict them. You know what I mean? And I guess this is, are we okay with that? In the ways in which it's restricting it?
Yeah, and I think that's an important point. To the second half of the theme of this episode, what are rights and who gives it to us? The government has placed these restrictions, and I think it's interesting the times that we're in these days when the government makes a decision about those rights. Half of the people are going to say, well, because it was that party that was in charge of the government at this particular time, I don't agree with those restrictions, and therefore, my rights are being trampled. But it's, we as a society have said that we trust the government to place certain restrictions on our rights. And again, I also don't want to go down an economic route, but if we're going to let the market decide for economics, that is the point of elections. And so there are, to some extent, like the government that we put in charge gets to place certain restrictions on those rights within reason. And I know that sounds blasphemous for me to be saying right now because of the current party that's in government and my current party. But I mean, that is, we trust the government to place those restrictions. And
I think though we trust the government to place those restrictions within the framework that's outlined within the Constitution, right? And we don't expect them to act outside of that framework, which is where you see some tensions. And again, this isn't every administration, right? The whole reason that the court is there supposedly to call balls and strikes is because it's not always clear cut, where the boundaries are, right? And it's not always clear cut what the law permits or doesn't permit. But I do think where I start to feel uneasy is when it doesn't seem like the government is actually adhering to the framework of the Constitution and of our laws. And where the rule of law is weakened or appears to be weakened is where then I start to feel uneasy about my rights, because I don't think the government gives us our rights. I agree with Brett. They're rights that we have naturally, and I think it's the role of the government to protect those rights. The government is not a god, it's not a king. These are rights we naturally have. I do think there are certain rights that are inalienable. And that's where I do see the role of the government to protect those rights. And at times, quite often, I think that our leadership on both sides, I hate using that term, but on both sides loses track of that quite often. So,
well, Will, do you also agree that?
Go ahead, Dion.
Sorry, Will, do you also agree? So all the 3 out of the 4 of us have explicitly stated so far that we believe that our rights come from some power above the government and that our rights are granted to us by the government. Do you agree with that statement? Okay. Yeah. I just want to make sure.
No, so to your point, yes, like our rights are given to us by, like, they're natural, right? But when they come in conflict with each other, we have said that the government can, I can't go around killing people. I don't have unlimited liberty, even though the right to liberty is a natural right. So like we have said, with the whole point of the government, Thea, what'd you say? Like call balls and strikes? The full government to include the judicial branch, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, we have inalienable rights, but they're not carte blanche. They're not. Thea, what'd you say earlier? Like they're just not. There's restrictions on all of our rights.
Yeah, they're not unlimited. It's like your rights are not unlimited in that capacity. Because as soon as they infringe upon the rights of another person, that's where that boundary stops, right? So, and that's just a key understanding with that is, again, we kind of talking about the life and liberty, but I mean, what does liberty mean? I think that's a key point is actually discussing, okay, what would you consider like the definition of liberty? Because if you don't define that or at least have a framework to go from, it's kind of hard to say, right? So for me, when you're talking liberty, personal autonomy, right? The ability to make decisions about your own life and whether that's your religion, your speech, your movements, your associations, you have that choices, but then you have economic freedom is another key point to that, where you have the right to own property, to engage in voluntary trade, and you can pursue your profession without government's undue interference, right? Where they're not regulating you to the nth degree. But then you have political freedoms, right? That political liberty, the right to participate in governance, you vote, express your opinions, all those kind of things. But then you have the protection from oppression, right? And of course, that's where the government kind of works in that. But what that means is you can't be, imprisoned arbitrarily. You can't be forced into labor, because that impinges on people's rights. So that's kind of where that liberty kind of plays into it. But agreeing to Thea's point, the biggest thing is that the government is meant to protect our liberties. It does not grant it, right? But liberty is not unlimited. It does have bounds. But where we have to manage that with government is that we have to make sure that we don't veer into tyranny, right? That's the biggest thing. And that's why the statement of we the people, understanding that the people have power with things and that we can voice those opinions, because that is a liberty that we have in this country that a lot of the world doesn't have, right? That we have the right to petition against the government. It's in the First Amendment, right? That we have that ability, because if not, if we start getting where tyranny starts happening, it's because they're infringing upon liberties without just cause. And again, that's that balance. We go back to the COVID example. The just cause was there to say, hey, we kind of need to shrink your liberties a little bit here until we know what's going on. Again, that'll be a full-blown discussion in terms of what exactly that looks like and what information was given to the public in a proper time frame. But yeah, initially, I agree with Dion that I think except for the few hardcore people, most people are like, you know what, I'm willing to reduce my own personal liberties until we know what's going on, right? And then we can...
So let me speak on behalf of the hardcore libertarians for a second. And again, we really need to have a whole COVID discussion, but going back to the life versus liberty thing, a lot of them would have made the argument that if the masks truly worked, then you could choose to wear a mask and that would protect you. And then if I wasn't wearing a mask, the whole point of you wearing a mask is to give yourself a protective barrier, right? That would have been their argument, that you don't have to force me to wear a mask because you yourself have decided to protect yourself. Now, I don't know, like, again, in the beginning parts of COVID, we definitely had no idea what was going on. But as we later learned, the masks really weren't as effective as people had hoped anyways, whether it was somebody wearing it and then coughing at you or you were wearing it. But
I mean, I think though, I would rather use a different example of like a seatbelt, right? So a lot of times when you have government regulation, and granted seatbelts, there's much more, we know there's more studies, more data and all that. But in theory, a lot of times restrictions on liberties are placed for basically to say, we're not going to give you the option because we know the absence of this thing has, it even if it's to protect you, right? Because I guess the true libertarian would be like, if I don't want to wear a seatbelt, that's my business, right? But we know there are laws that say in order to drive a car, you have to wear a seatbelt, right? And I think there's a lot of examples in our society where you do have this parental role of government, where the government is telling you what to do for your own safety, right? Not only just for the safety of others. And maybe it's because you don't want, we know car accidents are, can be very fatal, and huge numbers of people still, even with seatbelts, die in car accidents. But I guess the role of having that law in place is to increase the safety of driving, I
mean, as a libertarian, I take a lot of issues with a lot of these laws, right? Like, I mean, I wear my seatbelt, and you knew me when I was riding a motorcycle, and I like full face helmet, gauntlet gloves, armored jacket, armored pants, and like knee-high boots, right? Every single time that I got on the road on my motorcycle. Not because the government told me I had to, but because I actually wanted to keep myself alive and safe. But I mean, we can talk about, I think seatbelts is one of those things where most people who have two rational brain cells to rub together would go, yeah, that makes sense. But we could talk about like marijuana, cocaine, heroin, LSD, right? There are so many substances that the government is like, nope, you can't do that because it's bad for you. But yet you want to go out and booze it up. That's fine. You want to go out and smoke a pack a day and ruin your lungs. That's fine. You could do that. Why is that, right? Like, I personally don't think that the government should be playing parent to adults. I have a saying that I don't know if I got the basis for it from somebody else or if it was just a random brain fart that I had, but I believe that the only laws that should exist are those that protect my liberty and life from your tyranny. Period. Dot. And so, like, if we want to talk about like guns, like you brought up, you can't buy a fully automatic weapon in the United States. Well, I'm a gun owner. And thus far in my entire life, including when I was deployed to Afghanistan, the only thing that I've ever shot at is paper. Right. So it's not the ownership of the gun, no matter what type of gun I have. And I have everything from a revolver to, an AR-15, whatever, I have several different types of. Not once have I been inclined to point that at a person. Right. Because it's illegal to kill somebody. It's illegal to commit homicide. And so, like, placing all of these additional restrictions on my right to bear arms doesn't change the fact that I'm not the kind of person that wants to go out and kill people.
Okay, Dion, I want to hit on that real quick because that's a point I want to touch on. Right? You say that it's illegal to kill people, but here's the thing, right? Is the law defining your morality, or have you chosen that standpoint for yourself because of who you are? Because again, that goes back to my
I believe in life,
argument.
liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? So I believe that everybody has the right to life.
Brett made a good argument that I would not have made. Yeah, because it's even that the law, because you're still pointing to the government creating a law that, forbids you to point that gun and shoot somebody else unjustly or unlawfully.
Right, because like I said, the only laws that should exist are the ones that protect your life and liberty and pursuit of happiness from my tyranny, right? So that is a direct example of a law that protects your life from my tyranny. I can't kill you. To me, that's a law that should exist.
I mean, and so I hope this is definitely an episode we need to have with guns and the Second Amendment, because I've always find that gun owners use themselves as the example of why these restrictions should exist. It's always the person making the argument saying, well, I would never do this. And it's like, yeah, there's a lot of things you would never do. But obviously we can just look at the statistics, and that doesn't stop many people from taking those weapons and using them in beyond unlawful ways. So the argument in favor of the restrictions is that while you may not be a tyrant with your gun, we have so much evidence to show that there are many people within the population that are tyrants with their gun, and they use it to go into elementary schools and kill children. And we as a society have said, well, we're okay with that because people should have the right to do that, or to have access, the ability to do it. Right. And so that's a whole, like I said, that's another art, but that's the thing. At the end of the day, our laws aren't necessarily there to restrict the best of us. They're also there to restrict the worst of us. Right. And
but even if you make something illegal, does that keep someone from doing it? Right.
Well,
that's
the argument with
there's a lot of illegal
drugs.
People still use them.
Yeah,
it's illegal to not wear your seatbelt, yet people still do. Like it's again, it comes back to the basic argument of.
But the argument is we don't have to make it easy.
Legislate it.
But the government doesn't have to make it easy, right? So a lot of these restrictions are designed to put hurdles and barriers to either reduce the amount of people who can do these things or make it painful for them to do it, right? So you can choose not to wear your seatbelt, but if you get pulled over, now you got to pay a fine, risk getting, losing your driver's license, all that kind of stuff. You can use illegal drugs, but ask all these people in jail for, selling and using cocaine, meth, heroin, whatever you want to call it. There's a consequence. So we've now made it harder for people to do those things, right? And so the argument when it comes to certain restrictions that we haven't put in place is we've made it easy for the worst amongst us to do horrible things by not putting restrictions in place, right? And so that's where, again, like I said, I'm somebody who's okay giving up liberty in favor of protecting life. Right. And so I think I'm being consistent there.
Let us not forget that one of the rallying cries of one of the colonies was "Give me liberty or give me death." So there are lots of people out there who say that a life without liberty is not a life worth living. And I would also say that, like, the role of government, especially this particular federal government, given the U.S. Constitution, they absolutely should not be putting restrictions on those first 10 amendments the Bill of Rights. Like, it's like written into that document that these are the things, and especially the second one that says shall not be infringed, right? Like, for the government to then come out and say, we recognize that these are all rights that belong to the people that we are not allowed to infringe on, and then to come back into Congress and be like, but we're going to go ahead and start slowly but surely whittling away all of these rights that you have.
we like I said, we need to have a conversation about the Second Amendment, because it seems like a well-organized militia doesn't seem to matter today. And I understand what Heller did, but that particular of all the member, like of all the amendments in the Bill of Rights, it seems that people want to focus on one part of it and ignore the rest of the language. So again, I really think we should have a whole, because we could, we could go down a rabbit hole with the Second Amendment.
Take it into the First Amendment. We put limits on freedom of speech all the time. Like there's all of the defamation. So by legal definitions, by the way, the Bill of Rights are a Bill of Liberties. Like those are liberties that protect you from the government doing things to you. But like almost every one of them, there are restrictions on. They're not unlimited. Like you can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater. Like you can't. There are certain things you can't do. Back in the day, it was you can't burn your draft card because like you needed that. You could burn the American flag, but you couldn't burn your draft card because your draft card was needed to actually go serve in the military. Like there are lots of the first 10 amendments that there are restrictions.
The fact of the existence of limitations and infringements on rights does not convince me that they should be there. In fact, it just gives me further reason to be distrustful of the government for having slowly but surely over 250 years whittled away those rights.
There's no right to life in the first 10 amendments. Like, if your First Amendment right infringes on my right to life, it'll be restricted.
Well, but that comes in the Constitution. That was before the Bill of Rights.
Yes, but that's what I'm saying. Like there are restrictions on the Bill of Rights because of other rights that you have. Like you can't just say nothing in the Bill of Rights can be restricted.
Right. No. So I guess let me be clear in that I am not an anarchist. I would probably say that I'm like a minimal statist in that I understand that government and laws are a necessary evil to living in a society, especially one of 330 some odd million people. So I get that. It's kind of one of those things that it's not ideal, right? Ideally, we would have a beneficent dictator, right? But
yeah.
And people would act
we have what we have.
So better angels, but they don't.
The thing is, I don't see them as a necessary evil. I see them as a good thing, right? Like, and I guess that's where me becoming a lawyer, I believe in the rule of law. And when I fundamentally disagree with the law, that's where I do think being part of the political process is important, and you seek to change the law to make it more just. And I know I'm somewhat naive in that instance, in that way, but I don't see our rule of law and our society and our system of a rule of law as being evil or bad. And you talk about distrusting the government. My personal the struggle I've always had when we talk about the Bill of Rights, we talk about the founding fathers, we talk about all of these rights that people had. Of the four of us, I am the one person that at the time of the document, and we're assuming, Dion, you would have been classified as a white male. I had no rights. Like these rights that we're arguing, I didn't have them at that, when these documents were written, and the founding fathers were not envisioning me as someone who would possess those rights. Yet I still believe in the document, right? And it's not lost on me that we have never been a perfect union, and our government has gotten it wrong a lot, throughout our history. But I do think we should, I still do trust the system that eventually, we will strive towards perfection, or we will strive to get it right. And so I do still think our system of laws is good and just. I don't see it as evil, and I guess that's the optimist in me.
So let me also be clear too for all of our listeners and viewers. I have lived and traveled around the world. The United States of America is by and large the greatest place in the world to live. We are free economically, politically, socially, and despite our flaws, this is the best country in the world. However, I think it could be better, and I think the way that it could be better is if we got government out of more people's lives, out of the way, and let people be more free.
And I think if people acted according to their better angels, that is an optimistic, like it's a very noble way to think about it. I don't think that's possible. Like most of these laws and restrictions are in place because we have seen that people do not act in that way.
So let me then again sort of flip that back on you. The government is made of people, and you've just said that most people do not act according to their better angels. And so what we have done is we have imbued the government. Okay, I mean, it
many.
One rotten apple spoils the bunch, right? So it doesn't even take most. It can be a handful, but people don't act according to their better angels, and people make up the government, and we have imbued the government with more power. And so now what we've done is we've given a select set of people who seek power more power over other people.
That's why we have separation of power and checks and balances, because sometimes there are people who seek power and nothing but power, and they want to abuse that power. And you would think that the other co-equal branches of government would exercise their power to keep that bad apple in check. But that's not where we're at today.
And this is where I agree with Brett in that I wish more people we would have a better system for educating people and allowing people to be more engaged, right, within their communities, within government, within everything, right? Because I think that if more people were directly engaged in our system and saying, what should our government doing? Having the conversation we're having now, I do think that we would be living in a different country where we wouldn't have the same amount of polarization and the same level of apathy and cynicism when people talk about government. And so that is part of why I am trying to engage more, especially now, because I do feel like it helps me feel better about whatever's going on if I feel like I'm trying to work towards the things that I believe in, right? And I do think part of doing that is talking to people and try to understand if they don't believe what I believe, why don't you, what is it that you believe? And why do you think differently? And then kind of engaging and trying to figure out not necessarily a middle ground, but a workable solution.
So Will, to your point that you made, we essentially have all three branches of government controlled by a single party right now.
I know, that's bad.
And I know, and I know a lot of my friends on social media on your side of the aisle are freaking out because they are afraid of losing their rights. They're afraid of losing freedoms and liberties that they have. They're afraid of the direction that the country's going to go in. And I guess my point is, like they're making my point that government has become so big and so powerful that it is ruining people's lives, and it should never have gotten to that point in the first place. Like, we shouldn't be at a point where the federal government is so pervasive in your life that if a single party were to take over all three branches of government, all of a sudden you freak out.
So I should clarify, not that one party is in charge. Right now, one person is in charge. One person has taken over the Republican Party, and the other co-equal branches of government are not acting in accordance with their powers in the Constitution. Members of Congress will not stand up to the president, right? Whatever the president wants, people are bowing to him, and he has deputized Elon Musk to do these things. To your point that the government has gotten so big and pervasive that it's affecting people's lives. I mean, that's sure, we could have that discussion. Like, the government is quite large and expansive. But it's not, I do want to clarify, it's not that one party's in charge. It's that one person is in charge. That party no longer exists in my mind.
I disagree that it's one person, and I do believe that it's become an oligarchy, and that oligarchy has infested our government at all levels, whether it be local level, state for sure, and definitely federal level. And this is where we see, primaries, this idea that, we've pulled our parties to the extremes because of the way that people can be primaried, right? And so, especially, I think, from my opinion, looking at the right now, the reason that Donald Trump has so much power is because of his ability, especially with when you have someone like Elon Musk and other folks of similar economic status, like funding the idea that, hey, if you go against me at any level, we'll just push you out of office because we have enough money to primary you or to, push you out. And so I don't think it's just Trump. I do think that he has an inordinate amount of control over the Republican Party, but at some point he won't be there, and the damage will be done, and we'll still be living in what was created as a result of where we currently are. And I don't think that the Democratic Party is immune to some of the problems that I just spoke of, right? As far as having an oligarchy and because I do think if money wasn't such a big role in politics, I don't think Biden would have just sailed to his second to be able to run for president, this past, last year. I think if other people were more free to just step in and you didn't have all these different outside influences, I don't think that we would have seen Biden running for reelection or unchallenged in the way that we did. Right. So I guess my fear is that it's not government, Dion, that I'm afraid of. Is this influence on the government from the outside that I'm seeing. And I think our system's being tested. And I don't know. I don't know where we're going to end up. Well, so I need the people to get involved.
So that's where I think that our founding fathers were really wise. They established this form of government, as imperfect as it is, where they tried to separate the powers and have these different branches of government be checks on each other, because I'm sure they knew that there would always be outside influences on government. People with money and power will seek to create more money and power for themselves. If they're not directly in government, then they will seek to lobby and influence government, right? So I don't think they were naive to that. I'm sure that was going on in the late 1700s just as much as it is going on right now. So going back to that wisdom of the founding fathers, I think, it was, what was interesting is if you read through some of the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist papers, and you read through some of the news clippings of the time, they were kind of split on whether a Bill of Rights was even necessary, because they said, well, the Constitution says that the government only has these powers. So a Bill of Rights is superfluous because they don't have any power to infringe on these rights already. So what do we need that? And yet what we've seen, as I've said, and as we've discussed, we have a Bill of Rights, and then we've seen an encroachment on them. Whether you think that is a valid encroachment or not, it has been a slow encroachment on certain rights more than others, of course.
But the reason that so people were afraid of a strong executive who wanted to call himself a king. And in order to get the people in the states to impress upon their leaders to ratify the Constitution, they had to include it to say, extra sure, there will not be this strong of a central government. There will, even though the Constitution doesn't give them these powers, we're going to also write down these powers that they don't have. And yet we're back at a place where Trump is calling himself king, that he does not have to listen to the Constitution, and that he alone decides what the law is. And so they were there to assure the people that we wouldn't go back to where we are right now.
I mean, I think I agree with Dion. I don't think that the founding fathers anticipated that the members of each branch of government would just acquiesce their power to the executive. I don't think that was the intent. I don't think that they foresaw that we would come to a place where you would have an executive that sought to grow their power, and that the other branches would just kind of go along with it and lay over, and say, rub my belly. You know what I mean? And so I think that's where we are seeing our systems be tested. But the solution to the problem is the people engaging, because we're the ones who grant government power ultimately. And so that those other branches of government, we're the ones who ultimately put, at least with the legislator. And that was always designed to be the most powerful branch of government. I don't think like you said, Dion, when you read the Federalist Papers and you're reading the works of the time, the intent was for the legislative branch to be the strongest branch of government by far. Like, that's not even debatable. And so what upsets me is when I see the legislative branch in such a deadlocked, non-functioning state as what we see as far as the U.S. House and Senate go. Because the intent was for that to be the body that deliberated, that, made the laws and did all, you know what I mean? And I just don't see that happening. And so when you talk about the rights of the people, those were supposed to be the representatives of the people across the country, across the union, And now that's where I don't have faith. I guess that's my cynical part, where I don't have faith in the legislative branch. I've never had high expectations of the executive, but I guess I did have the expectations of the legislative branch to keep them in check, right? So that my rights would be protected, and so that, and again, with balls and strikes, when you're talking about the tensions between rights, right? The ability for one person to marry another and another person to have their religious freedom and believe what they want to believe. How should the law deal with that? I did expect the legislator to deal with, to have an answer. And they just don't, and that's where the courts are supposed to come in. And, it's just like, so it's just disappointing right now to watch the executive branch kind of go off on their own in a way that feels non-inclusive of the other branches of government. And especially when they're all ruled by the same party right now. That's what's even more.
And Thea, I think that's kind of the point you're making in terms of like the oligarchy standpoint, right? Where politics is run by money. Is when there is power in government, we have problems, right? When people can sit in government and contain power and keep it for long periods of time, that causes issues. Because the way the legislative branch is run right now, it is not a true representation of the people. We have these people who have sat in government basically for generations. They're like, well, my granddaddy was a senator. My dad was a senator. Now I'm a senator. I'm like, I'm sorry, you are no longer of the people. You have no clue what your constituents actually want. And so when we have these people that sit there for multiple terms, I mean, my goodness, I think McConnell has said he's finally retiring after 8 terms because he's been there since 1994, 30 years. Right. You're just separated. Right. And there's many others that are like that as well. That's where we have the problem. And that swings back around to what you were saying before, Thea, is people are not well educated around how our political processes actually work. And this goes back to the text conversation that we as a group were having this week when we were talking about needing to entertain the populace. Right. Here's the thing. When people are entertained, they're distracted. Right. They think they have better things to do with their time. And so they do that rather than educating themselves in ways that actually affect their life, rather than just satiating their need for escapism.
So, Brett, are you saying that we need to make this podcast more entertaining?
We
might need to. I don't know. We'll see how that plays out.
We could start yelling at each other more. I mean, but what I'm hearing, though, is that we're all going to say when Trump tries to do his 3rd term that we're all going to be against that, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. Got it.
But we're not a good example.
I think the majority of Americans will be against
example.
I don't, Brett. I don't have that faith.
We're not a good example of the flanks of our parties, right? Like, there's a reason why Dion had to say, well, the extreme libertarian would say, right? And we will say, well, the MAGA person would say, and we'd be like, well, the uber progressive, because none of us are that, right? We wouldn't, to be honest, we probably wouldn't be doing this if we represented the flanks of our parties, right? But my issue is more, I think most people are us. I don't believe most people are the flanks. I just don't. And I think it's kind of like what Brett was saying. People are too busy doing other things, right? And it's just like they're not engaged enough to be that passionate, to be at the extreme ends of most political parties, right? But I think we have, I guess our system we haven't built a system that brings people in. And that's the question. Well, how do you bring more people in? so that it's more representative and you don't have this oligarchy. And I guess the oligarchy does include some of our career politicians, right? Because even for better or worse, Joe Biden is what you described in McConnell. The fact that he was one of the youngest senators and then was the oldest president, or was one of the oldest presidents. It's, I don't think that's a good thing. I don't like that Dianne Feinstein just died in office and for all intents and purposes probably wasn't, didn't have full capacity as, by the time she went. I didn't like that RBG died and, died on the bench and all those things. And so, and they are seen as liberal heroes, but I was critical of it at the time. I'm still critical of it. Pelosi, she can barely walk. I know she's done great things, but I say great things in that she's had made history. She from a strategic standpoint and looking at how she managed the her caucus when she was speaker. You know what I mean? Same thing with McConnell. They had their moments, but it's time to move on, right? And that's where it's like, as people, it's time to say, okay, like we can't just let people sit in these positions and just then expect them to advocate for our rights, And so, and I think some of the discussions about where rights stand today has changed and evolved in ways that their generation has left them behind. But so why are we leaving them to be the ones representing us, right? When you talk about pronouns.
Well, Will's not.
Yeah, but but when we talk about pronouns, I look at the discussion. It's kind of, even for us, we're kind of the old kids in the room, and that we didn't grow up with it. But now when I talk to the kids about it, they seem to understand it better than I do, and they engage with it in a very different way than how I engage with that topic versus my parents, and I just wish that we would be more open to bringing more people into the conversation, because I do think it would be a different conversation.
And for what it's worth, I would be in favor of term limits, despite the fact that I'm going to be in office. I don't know. I'm interested to see when it happens to me that, you don't want to give up power so badly that like those people couldn't have been living, fruitful, happy lives, struggling to live while struggling to govern. Like, I just don't get that.
I think I look at it from the sports. I think I brought this up in the past, right? How many people go out having just won their the Super Bowl, right? Like there's always those Hall of Fame athletes that play one too many seasons, right? Like Jordan on the Wizards. You know what I mean? Like there's always that. And I think it's the same. There's a certain type of person that it's very hard for them to let go and move on to a different stage, and but there's also that same type of person that the audacity to be whatever they were, right? Like there's only a certain, I don't know if you guys have watched The Last Dance, but if you haven't, please do. Like it's an insight into how Michael Jordan saw himself and the audacity he had and as he approached competition. You want that in your leaders, the person who thinks, I can do the thing that everybody says I can't do, or the thing that seems impossible, we can accomplish it. You want that, but then at some point it needs to be curtailed, because that same type of person is not likely to say, maybe I'm not the person to lead at this. You know what I mean? And I love Jordan, even though I'm a Kobe fan. I love Jordan, but he played past his prime. Tiger Woods played past his prime. So many, Brady. So I just feel like that I wouldn't look to them to protect my rights. And I feel like that's what we do with government right now. The equivalent in politicians is who is sitting there. The people who maybe once upon a time were great, but it's time to move on. And that's how Trump kind of came into power, because people were tired of seeing the same old, for better or worse.
I'm hoping that's going to change, right? But again, this comes back to our discussion where people need to be more involved in the processes and look more at their local governments and be involved there and see how that transitions up. Because here's the thing, guys, our government is a representation of the people, whether we want to admit that or not, right?
Yeah.
It's like we do elect these people. And if there's somebody in that seat and you're like, I really don't want them here, then there should be a process to say, no, like you don't get to just come back as the incumbent. Yes, term limits are one of those.
Yeah.
The people should also just understand, like, hey, just because that's the way we've always done it, it shouldn't be the way. There should be a process that people can step up and know and say, no, I'm not going to vote for them. I want someone else. But if they're unaware, then they're not going to spend any time on it.
Yeah. I mean, I think the discussion, there is, I mean, because the thing is, the process exists. It's just a level of engagement, and how do you get more people to be engaged? Because when I say I want more people to be engaged, I don't assume that those people are going to agree with me on everything. But I think I would feel better about, like, for example, I especially with a lot of times with when I'm doing, trying different cases or working on different legal teams, there's times where I don't agree with the strategy. But when I look around the room and I see, especially at my first law firm, I was at a very big firm, and so we would have like weekly or staff meetings, and sometimes people would discuss what was going on in their case, and you would have like a robust discussion with 20 lawyers in the room. And I remember there are times where I'm like, I don't get why we're doing it this way or why they're doing it that way. But when I would hear all 20 people kind of come to some kind of consensus, I felt better even if I disagreed, because I'd be like, well, everybody around me seems to be buying into the strategy, right? So maybe let me sit back and watch and see what I'm missing. I think I would feel better about our government if I felt like it really was the majority of people are engaged. But right now, I don't feel like it's the majority of people. It's some people are engaged, but it's not the majority. And
it's
that's
not
why
enough, and that's you're absolutely right in that. Exactly. And that goes back to what Will was saying before, is that, the current government just kind of going along things when we look at the legislative branch, it's because I don't think people are aware of their rights. So they're not making their voices heard to their representatives. Because again, like, if you don't know your rights, how do you know they're being violated? Right. And so when people are just unaware of that stuff, again, they're just like, you know what? Hey, government's going to handle it. I'm going to go Netflix for a while. It's just unfortunate. People are just so disengaged. And that's where, again, knowing your rights and understanding that and how the government is supposed to protect them is key to actually coming to a point where the government actually does what it's supposed to and protects those rights and doesn't have to come up with all these laws, because you do have a society that's engaged.
So what I'm hearing is universal vote by mail, election day on a weekend, online registration, like same day register, like to get more people to vote.
It's not just about voting, though, Will. It's about awareness. Right? That's the big thing. Because even if people are voting, but they don't know what they're voting for, what does that matter?
Yeah. That's what I would say. I would say, really, we're talking about like bringing back civil engagement and talking about civics at a young age with kids, young people, trying to build community more, right? And I mean, I think what I hear is organizing. A lot of what organizers do and their strength is in connecting with people and trying to bring people
civics classes in school, right? Like, I'm sorry, Shakespeare entertainment, sure, there's interest in knowing the history there, but spending so much time on some of the classes that we spend, it's unnecessary. I think having more civics classes and governance and understanding those type of things would be much more valuable to the education of our youth and some of the stuff we're spending time on.
But the problem is the parties are going to argue about what is taught in those civics classes, because they're going to feel like one party or the other is getting the shaft, or that people are focusing on the wrong things in that civics class. Like, and because that's something that we're dealing with in Florida is, I think for like our age, it was social studies, and it wasn't quite civics, but it was the closest thing that we had. I never had a specific civics class.
No, I had social studies and government.
Yeah. And government. But like, the way that it's being discussed now, though, is like, well, okay, we're going to bring back civics, but what we really mean by that is just these authors or just these aspects of civics, because that would favor one party or the other.
Yeah, but see, that's an incomplete education.
Yeah. I've always said we underestimate our youth, and their capacity to think for themselves when given the ability, when somebody asks them what they think. I have a now 13-year-old here, and every now and then I'll ask her a question, and I'm continuously surprised and amazed at like the things she thinks about and the things she's aware of. And so when I do engage with her, there are times where I'm like, oh, you really don't know about the world. But then there's other times where I'm like, oh, you do have an idea or a sense of where, of the world. And the more you engage, the more, even my 7-year-old, the more you engage with him, the more you start to see him thinking for himself. And what I think when you see these debates about what to bring in the schools, there's this fear that if we allow kids to have real conversations, somehow they're not able to, or somehow that's a bad thing, to just let them have the information and let them synthesize it.
I think they should be able to have those conversations. I'm saying the people that are trying to bring civics back to the classroom they want to limit,
don't want them to.
One side or the
and
other.
I think it's coming from a place of fear, and that's our problem. That's where book bans. Like, at the end of the day, I don't know. I think you got to there's a level of, I'm trying to learn how to find that balance with allowing my kids to experience the world as it is while still trying to protect them, And I think I don't think anyone thinks the overprotective parenting style necessarily always produces good results. We always have the rebellious kids, and my parents were super strict, so I rebelled, and so it's like, I don't want that for my kids, but I also want them to kind of go into the world from an informed perspective. You know what I mean? And then hopefully, as I've informed them, then they can figure things out for themselves. I don't think that we're going to get there by not allowing kids to have real conversations in school.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Well, I think we're kind of drifting off topic here, folks. I mean, we've got touched a lot of points, but it all comes down to, I think one of the biggest things that we need to make sure people are aware of is education, right? And I don't mean just from like go to school kind of thing, but actually taking time to educate yourself on both sides of the information. Will, I know that you're an avid reader when it comes to that stuff, and that gives you a more informed position to make your decisions. And I think that's what we should advocate for, is people doing that. My big thing with that is, specific to this podcast, educate yourself on your rights. Actually know what rights you have, so therefore you can know when they're infringed upon. And the example I can give of that is when you look at federal agents that are trained in identifying counterfeit money, they're not given counterfeit dollars to study. They're given the real deal. And they study it so intently that they know every detail. So when they look at something that's a little off, they can spot it immediately. Yeah. And that's how you should be with your rights. You should know them well enough that when somebody pushes against you, you're like, oh, hey, that's not okay. But most people have no idea, and they're getting beaten left and right with the law and not knowing what to do about it.
I'm reminded of the article that just came out the other day about people being upset that immigrants know their rights too well, so that when they're approached by ICE agents, it's frustrating. And that they wanted to like arrest members of Congress for educating people on their rights.
Yeah,
no, you should know your rights.
Absolutely.
Just thought I'd bring that up.
Yeah, the know your rights briefing.
We've gone pretty long on this. We did stray from the original topic a little bit there at the end, but I'm going to summarize real quick before we get into what's been making us happy. And I think what I heard is we all agree that we all have natural rights, whether they come from a personal God or they come from just the very inherent nature of us being human beings. We have rights that are not given to us by the government, but that are inherently ours, and that it's up to the government to help protect in each and every one of us. Sounds like where we differ on our spectrum is the balance between life and liberty between different parties, right? So how much do we balance life over here versus liberty over there? How much do we balance liberty versus liberty, and where we sort of, which side of the scales we put our thumbs on? So sounds like from Thea and Will, your primary concern is life and safety, right? So when it comes to balancing those different aspects, it sounds like if you were to put your thumb on the scale, you would put it on the side of, well, I'm going to preserve life first and foremost, and then I'll worry about the others later. I think for myself, and I won't speak for Brett, you can chime in here if you want, but for myself, I tend to lean towards give me liberty or give me death, and I tend to lean towards a life without liberty is not worth living. So that's where I fall. Brett, where are you?
I'd say I'm a bit more to your side, Dion. It's life is paramount, right? To where you have to have that right to life, because without your life, you don't have any other rights, right? But at the same time, having that freedom and that autonomy, if you lack that, if you're restricted, I think it's a degraded lifestyle. Yes, I understand the difference with, you look at social contracts and constructs that we interact with other people. But when we get to the point where we are limited in our ability to live our life, I think that causes problems.
All right. So Will or Thea, if I said something that you didn't agree with, go ahead and chime in. But otherwise, let's get into what's been making us happy.
So this week I got to take my daughter. Sorry, Thea, I didn't give you a
It's
chance.
fine.
All right.
Yeah, I would have spoke up.
I got a chance to take my daughter to a STEM competition, basically a statewide competition. And one of her teams placed second in the state. And to see like the pure joy of 12-year-old girls like screaming and jumping and cheering and like just the pure happiness. I was miserable at the conference. 1,000 some odd middle schoolers, just utter chaos. But like that one 30-second moment at the end of the whole competition and just seeing how happy she was it made the whole trip worth it. It was really awesome.
Nice. For myself, it's actually work related, but I was out in Colorado this past week. One of the programs that I work on, we're flying some experimental satellites out of an ops floor in Colorado Springs, and just it's a great group of people, and it's different from the normal day-to-day cubicle life that I live here in the DC area. So it was just really cool to go out there, kind of be a little bit closer to the quote unquote pointy end of the spear, doing some of the things that matter and really getting to be an engineer, because a lot of what we do out there is problem solving. They are prototype experimental satellites, and they have a lot of let's say unique character aspects to each of them. And so we're doing a lot of the stuff that I wanted to become an engineer for, which is like, hey, this is an interesting problem. How are we going to solve that? Let's get creative. The real like no astronauts' lives are in danger, but very much like the Apollo 13 kind of, well, we've got to figure out how to do this with this, and all we've got is this bag of stuff here. Can you make it work? That kind of stuff. So I really enjoyed that this past week.
Good stuff. For me, it was more kind of family oriented this week. We had a surprise snow day that popped up on Thursday. I don't quite know why. We got like a dusting, but apparently they decided to close school for the day. So I got to hang out with my kids. Just spend some time with them. Of course, just being here in the house, making memories, going out, playing in the snow. I don't know. I just like those unprompted, unplanned times where you're just like, okay, well, what do you want to do today? Because this totally threw our plans out the window, so we got to change it up. And just the spontaneity that comes with that. It's just fun watching kids be kids. They went down in the fort, and for Christmas, they had gotten one of those like modular couches that you can build into a fort. And so, they're down there building the castle and, attacking each other. And it was just a lot of fun hanging out with them.
Mine is also career oriented. I actually accepted a new position at a new firm. So I'm changing jobs. I've kind of been going through this process for the last month. And it was very nerve-wracking, a little bit scary to make a move. I think anytime you change jobs, you're like, is this the right choice? And, but I'm going back to, now going back to specializing in labor and employment, litigation, and at a firm, being part of a team that's all that they do, or that's what we do, instead of being at where I was doing general litigation, all sorts of different types of cases, and I was becoming more of a generalist. And so I interviewed for about a month with this firm. I got an offer on Thursday and I accepted it on Friday. And I didn't think I'd be so emotional, but I was like, I was just so happy the process was over. Start work in a week. So I have this next week to kind of just decompress. I'll probably relax a little bit, clean my house, get myself ready for this new journey with my career. But I'm really looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to doing the type of work that I'm passionate about. And so hopefully big things. I think when you're doing the work that you love, it doesn't feel as onerous as it can be with these types of careers that we all have. So so that's what's making me happy. I got a new job. Does
your firm represent government civilians by any chance?
I don't think so. It wouldn't be. We tend to be on the defense side. So no. And so it just depends. But what I like being on the irony is, as a Democrat, I think that would surprise people. I typically represent companies in employment matters because I think it's important to be in the room. I know I've been in the room many a times where I'm looking across the room and being like, what? No, like you understand why you're getting sued, or not every employee that gets fired didn't deserve it. So I enjoy the role that I play, especially when it comes to employment work. I'm very passionate about it. I could talk about it for hours. So I'm looking forward to going back to that being my specialty and that being my focus. So yeah. Mm-hmm. I guess that's all we have. Oh, that's right. I did the intro, so I got to do the outro. Okay. So thank you guys, everybody, for listening to the end. I know this was more of a philosophical type discussion, but I think it's important for us to talk about why we believe what we believe, right? And what we see big picture, because that should be static regardless of what's happening in current events. And so this was kind of an opportunity for us to touch on, well, what do we think the government should be doing and what is its role? And it's helpful to see where we differ and why when it comes to policy discussions, we, kind of what is informing us to view or to take the stances that we take. So this was kind of a little bit of a foundational reset on our philosophical views of government and personal rights. Not sure what we're going to talk about next week, but thank you guys for listening. If you made it this far, we really appreciate it. Hit like, subscribe, or whatever you can do to help us bolster this podcast so we can continue to have these discussions and hopefully help people be more engaged and have a more informed citizenry. Okay. Good night.
Good night,
Bye, everybody.